Catherine, thanks for joining us today at RockCreek's offices to talk about your work and what it means for investment going forward. I'd love if we could start just kind of with our origin story, because I think it's unique and really special. You and I were both on the Unity Task Force a year ago, which was a really special time. Do you want to maybe start there, but I want you to also tell a little bit about your history, and then we'll get into some questions today.
Oh, wow. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for having me here. And I think that we're at a very exciting time, despite the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. But it's an exciting time for environmental justice and climate justice, and what those type of investments look like. So the way we came to know each other, I was actually appointed to the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force by Senator Bernie Sanders, who had visited Lowndes County and saw firsthand what was happening there with the underinvestment and poverty and the impact that environmental justice and climate change were having on the community. And when I came there, there was a natural evolution where we became friends, not just negotiators trying to determine what the Biden climate and environmental justice policy would be. And you, I, and Gina McCarthy were the three that put together the environmental justice policy we were part of that subgroup, and we became natural allies and have continued to work and been, what evolved as a working relationship became a friendship, and we're still trying to make things happen.
That's right. Well, I think for me, it stems from knowing your place and what you've been able to do through your career, which I'd love to just reflect on. I look at you as, you started out really on economic development. That's the hat you came in wearing, but quickly turned into advocacy, which led to storytelling. And now you've got this outstanding book that's flying off of shelves. And I'd love for you to reflect on that. I've had a chance to read it and really understand the deep history of Lowndes County, where that place is and how that special sort of corridor exists, the rich history, even thinking about where I'm from, which is Detroit, and how that informs your work. Could you talk a little bit about your book? And it just came out. It's not even a year off the shelves, but a little bit about it for those who haven't read it yet.
Yes, well, thank you for that question. My book is Waste One Woman's Fight Against America's Dirty Secret. I actually started the fight back in 2002 when I found out that poor people in particular in rural communities like Lowndes County, were being arrested because they could not afford on-site sanitation. And before that time, I didn't realize that was a problem, and as time grew, I learned more and I documented not only that story, but my story growing up. I was born in Birmingham, actually, and I was in Birmingham when the church was bombed in the 1960s. It seems like every time there was a major historical event in Alabama, my family was somewhere close by. It was like, I used to call myself the black female Forrest Gump, because it seemed like that's the way my story was evolving. And then later, we were in Montgomery, and then ended up in Lowndes County, which is where my father is originally from. And Lowndes County is located between Selma and Montgomery, and it has its own rich history, civil rights history, very close to Detroit, because a lot of people that left Lowndes County ended up in Detroit. And when people hear about the Selma to Montgomery March, they don't know that most of the Selma to Montgomery March route goes through Lowndes County. My parents were activists, and I met people like Stokely Carmichael and others that came there. But I also learned that there was a rich connection between people in Detroit and people in Lowndes County. When folk fought for the right to vote in Lowndes County, and they formed the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which was the original Black Panther Party. It was a political party. And they ran candidates, but a lot of people were kicked off the properties because they were sharecroppers. And they were kicked off the property and ended up living in tents, and one of the areas was a tent city. And the tents were purchased by people from Detroit. So I was even told that the cars that the members of SNCC drove came from the Big Three in Detroit.
Yeah, funny.
So I think it was just kind of natural that we became friends, but that's also part of my history. And not only did I do economic development and find out that it was hard to do economic development in an area that didn't have infrastructure. You don't have broadband access. There was no real sanitation infrastructure. It is hard to recruit a business to come to a place that doesn't have sanitation infrastructure. And that's when I decided I would just focus on that, because that is fundamental to all of us. We have to have water. It's something that we all have to have, but we all go to the bathroom too. Mm-hmm. But everybody doesn't have the right or the ability to flush and forget. Mm-hmm. And I've just decided to make that my life's work.
Yeah, and I appreciate it, and it is a story. If you haven't picked it up yet, take a look at the book Waste. It's very eye-opening, and when Catherine says something is shocking to her, you should pay extra attention. Well, one of the things I think is interesting, just thinking about our two places, is we often talk about the historic disinvestment. We're at an investment conference today, and so looking at the place like Lowndes County or what's happening in Detroit with flooding and climate impacts, which we can certainly talk about, and how that's played out specifically during COVID in Lowndes County. What are your thoughts on investment, perhaps what's happening on the Hill today? What are your thoughts with respect to, you're on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and there's a release yesterday in the Path to Justice 40. Could you talk about your views on these big policies which you're helping shape, and how that plays out in a place like Lowndes County?
Well, first of all, places like Lowndes County have been neglected for a very, very long time. And I think that for us to have the type of growth, even growth, and have equity, we have to have investments in those areas. Because Lowndes County is just right outside of Montgomery, which is the capital of the state of Alabama. And we find that a lot of these areas that have been neglected are not very far from urban areas, but for some reason, there's been a disinvestment or no investment in rural communities. And rural communities, even we look at COVID and what happened, where did people go when, at the height of COVID? They went to the rural communities, they left the cities in a large part to try to go to those areas. But what it exposed was the lack of infrastructure. I mean, I'm currently in a partnership with a major newspaper where we're covering wastewater failures around the country. And one of the rural communities, not just poor communities, but communities like the Hamptons. Our last article was in the Hamptons, where people left New York because of COVID, and they were living in those summer homes, more than a few months out of the year, and found out their wastewater infrastructure, which were on-site septic systems, were not working. It's coming back into the house. It's the same problem that they have in Lowndes County. That's why we were able to do a hookworm study and find evidence of hookworm and other tropical parasites there. So clearly there's a need to invest in sustainable infrastructure. We cannot build the way we have built and expect it to last with what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with rising groundwater levels. We're dealing with sea level rise. We're dealing with deluges of rain. And everyone, when they have these rain events, there's sanitation issues, especially around sewage coming back into people's homes. As recently as Monday, I was in the town of Mount Vernon, about 20 minutes outside of Times Square in New York, and people had sewage coming back into their homes. Some people have been complaining for 20 years, but it's even worse now. And that's going to be a problem that we will see around the country if we do not pass the type of infrastructure bill to address these real-time issues that we're dealing with. And climate change is only going to make it worse. It's just that the front line and the environmental justice communities are suffering first. That's why they need to get 40% of the investment. However, it impacts all of us, because as COVID has taught us, diseases don't stop at a boundary. It doesn't care which political parties we're members of. It doesn't care what our race is. If we get exposed to it, we will get it and could potentially have devastating effects. So likewise is true when we talk about basic infrastructure. We need to make sure that everybody has access to it. Mm-hmm. And it's also, in one of the richest countries in the world, we should not have these type of third world conditions existing.
Yeah, and I've had a chance to, like I said, read your book and have many conversations with you to know just how bad things got during the pandemic in Lowndes County. But also I understand that you've had a chance to travel around and get to know these other communities, and it is not restricted to, the South, or, we've talked about Alaska, we've talked about Oregon, you just mentioned the Hamptons. So these are pervasive issues that underscore this need for this critical investment in basic infrastructure. I worked on a different side of things, in my Detroit work many years ago on basics like street lights. But this is, the Build Back Better platform out of the White House is really about, in my view, leapfrogging. I've been talking a lot lately about slingshot, because there's some communities that just haven't had equal footing And so it's sort of a 1-2 punch. So could you unpack a little bit about the White House, the path, the guidance that just came out, I think, yesterday? Can you talk about that at all?
A little bit.
Okay.
Some of it I can talk about, but I do know that basically what it is looking at a whole of government approach to how to deal with these issues, and all of the federal agencies looking at the programs that they currently have available and see how it can be more equitable and how it can reach those areas that have been left behind. Because oftentimes, I remember in the Obama administration when they had they had an infrastructure package early on. It was a stimulus plan. As part of that stimulus plan, people had to have shovel-ready projects. And I just remember going to a meeting in Selma when officials were there from the administration, and the biggest complaint was, we don't have the capacity to get the funds, although the funds were available. So now we're trying to find out, we're trying to use some interim guidance to determine how to get the funds where they need to be. What kind of capacity is needed? How these programs need to be restructured? Are there any kind of regulatory obstacles that are in the way? And it's just a beginning. That's why it's the interim guidance, to try to figure out what's the best practice in order to make sure that these inequities that have been baked into our system don't continue to manifest. And that's one thing that I have to give this administration credit for, is conscious and being intentional about making sure that the Lowndes counties of the world get the help that they've been denied for so long.
Are you saying that diversity at the table matters?
Diversity at the table definitely matters, because I think oftentimes, and not just diversity in terms of race, it's diversity in terms of geographical locations, because oftentimes when I talk to people about wastewater issues who have been in cities that don't know what I'm talking about, never seen a septic tank, don't know how they function, doesn't know what it's like to be out in the rural communities, or people that have gotten lost because they think that their GPS is going to help them and there's no broadband signal or anything that's there for them to rely on. I think they're well-intentioned, but oftentimes we don't get a chance to hear the voices of people from rural communities, and I think having that type of diversity at the table is also very, very helpful. Even with the Weed Jack, we have people from Alaska. We have people, because in Alaska they're still using honey buckets in some parts of the state.
Can you explain what that is
A honey
in
bucket,
polite terms?
Well, a honey bucket is literally a bucket that takes the place of a toilet that people use, and they take it out and maybe throw it out wherever, or in an outhouse. In the case when I grew up, we had what was called slop jars, and these were night pots that people use when you wouldn't go outside at night to use the bathroom. And the other option was going to an outhouse. Well, in a lot of these communities, they don't have outhouses. Or if they did have some kind of infrastructure, because of the melting permafrost, it's been exposed and they're not working properly. So we can't talk about these environmental justice issues and diversity issues and not talk about climate change, because a lot of these communities are at the forefront of this, and we can't have, and we got to talk about climate justice as well. And that's what I think the new guidance that's come out of the White House is about.
So I know that the legislation that's being taken up, we're looking at everything from bridges to broadband, but you're really talking about some real key basic issues, and to the point of becoming an attractive place for investment for cities. Like, what message do you have for the investors that are watching and tuning in today, for places like Lowndes County or communities that are impacted? What is the strategy? You mentioned capacity. I couldn't agree with you more. I've witnessed that across the country. But what can you tell investors about coming to these places, and what conversations have you had about the openness for bringing in new, fresh investment? Because the federal government is not going to solve all of it, right? It has a role to play, but we do need outside investment.
Well, I think first of all, investors should look at their policies in terms of where they invest and see whether or not they discriminate against communities like Lowndes County. That when I was doing economic development, that was a real problem. They wouldn't invest unless they were communities that had a certain number of people that lived there, for an example. But there are things that they needed too in terms of basic services. And also, some of these communities are on the path to either Selma or Montgomery. People are going through there all the time, but they can't stop at a service station. They can't stop, there's no drugstore there. They have to go somewhere else. A lot of people have to leave the county to even go and get COVID vaccines. There are no hospitals there. There are no doctors there. But a lot of people are moving out of the cities too, and they're looking at these areas to go to. And I think my advice to investors would also be to be visionaries. You know, we got to start thinking about what's happening with climate change, that people are going to have to move, people are going to relocate, some people are going to have to be resettled in other areas. Where would those areas be? It could be the Lowndes counties of the world. So I think that looking at opportunities and look at what happens outside of this country. Clearly, investment goes to provide that type of infrastructure in other places. We have to do that here in the United States too. I'm not saying don't do it in other places, because I think we all need to have the access. But certainly we have ignored what is happening right here in our own backyard, and it's time for us to focus. And I think that looking inward and looking at a lot of these areas, especially a lot of the areas that are represented by the WEJAC, to see where the investment opportunities are will be a good place to start.
That makes sense. And I can't help but thinking about the folks that are here today. It's a real cross-section, you know, with local and philanthropy and investors. You mentioned the capacity at the local level to take on this investment. So message to the mayors and the governors out there from Catherine Flowers about how to be ready to receive either, you know, a Justice 40 targeted investment or outside investment in order to, you know, leapfrog, or as I say, slingshot these communities into modern infrastructure, world-class infrastructure.
And one of the ways that the investors could also be helpful, a lot of times these, even with the government programs, require a match. And oftentimes these small communities don't have the money to pay the 25% match, but they still need the infrastructure. They still need to have wastewater treatment systems, and they still need to have broadband, et cetera. And that could be an opportunity as well to be able to partner and provide the matches. And one of the last thing I like to say is that whenever one goes in to invest in the community, find opportunities for the local communities to have ownership too, because oftentimes that's not the case. That people would come in, they make the investments, but because there's no real skin in the game, sometimes the outcome is not what it should be. But let's look for projects in which there could be real partnerships, because there have been examples, unfortunately, where private investors have come in and the outcome has not been what it should be. But I think having at the table and providing ownership and business opportunities to local people in the community gets the buy-in that's needed for it to be successful.
Yeah, in Detroit there's a saying, if it's not with us, it's not for us, or if it's not with us, it's not about us. Well, it makes me think about the current president, as you know, is my former boss. When he thinks about climate change, he thinks about jobs. And so what I'm hearing is again, that intersectionality of you know, really listening to what a community needs and having a robust community engagement, which I think is the intention of the WEJAC and the path that just was laid out. But also, you know, finding jobs across the spectrum for folks to participate in this new economy, which I know has been a big conversation of this conference. Let me pivot a little bit and talk about the role for innovation. Because I mean, what you're talking about is some really basic stuff, right? But is there a role for innovation? I have an energy background, and that's kind of space I spend my time in. Not that it's easy to deploy new innovations, but it is something in my philosophy is deploy what we know works while we innovate in the things that will be game-changing. In your space, where do you see some innovation opportunities?
Well, we're actually moving our organization, the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, to the Huntsville area, North Alabama, because that is going to be the home of the Space Command. And we feel that the technology that has been used to treat wastewater in outer space could hold clues to how we treat wastewater now and in the future here, and do it in a way in which it can help us become more resilient as we deal with climate change. Because from what I understand, water is reclaimed when they go out in the outer space. And we know that drought is going to be one of the things that people are dealing with, will be dealing with, and are dealing with as it relates to climate change. And we would like to develop a system that can be reclaimed and reused. Actually, just imagine if one could go to, say, a Lowe's or a Home Depot and buy a system that would treat wastewater. Like today we buy HVAC systems, we buy We buy hot water heaters, and now we have tankless water heaters. I think that the space program can yield those answers, but we want to flip the engineering paradigm. We like to bring to the table people like Ben Wallace's brother. I'm mentioning Ben Wallace because, you know, Ben Wallace is a Piston and just got inducted into the Hall of Fame. Ben Wallace's brother works on a farm in Lowndes County. And what he does there, he keeps the tractors running. Those tractors are over 25 years old. They cannot find parts. But he fabricates the parts to keep them running. Now, the owner of the farm has sent his children to Auburn to run the farm, but they could not run the farm without Ben Wallace's brother, who did not go to college. I would like to bring to the table people like Mr. Wallace and aerospace engineers to see if we can come up with a common sense way to apply this technology and use it to be able to treat wastewater, so that in Mount Vernon, where they cannot rip up, doesn't make sense, they got to rip up all the streets to get rid of all those pipes. But instead of ripping up all the streets, what if we had something that people can put in their homes to treat their wastewater, and that would eliminate the problem. It also would allow us to settle parts of the U.S. that have not been settled. Most of the U.S. is rural, is unincorporated. But the reason people didn't move there was because we don't have the infrastructure. But we feel that we can create that infrastructure using common sense technology and space-age technology, bringing them together and coming up with something that'll work and doing it within 5 years.
Well, I can see why you're a MacArthur genius, because I would not have come up with that idea by myself. I'm going to go back to the beginning, our origin story, and I'm remembering some conversations without divulging the detail. It's in the document, page 54 to be specific. Cancer Alley. I've never been there, but part of what your life's work has really been is science storytelling. And, not to embarrass you, but when I think of the great influencers, like Rachel Carson was a huge influence. We talked about her, and you're being called the Aaron Brockovich of waste. I think you're up there, but telling the stories from these places with a science background, I think is what's been most impactful. And you can agree or disagree, but can you tell us about what you think can happen in Cancer Alley under this administration, or places like Lowndes County that have faced historic injustice, environmental injustice, and now you lay on climate impacts, which are here and now?
Well, I think science is very key to all of this. I mean, you probably wouldn't even know who I was, and I wouldn't have gotten a MacArthur Award had we not used science. And what we did was we worked with people in the community who were trusted, who were able to go and get fecal and blood samples from residents, who gave them to us, despite the Tuskegee story, who gave them to us. And we worked with Baylor, and we did the study and found out that these parasites existed. In places like Cancer Alley, where they're debating the air quality and whether or not there's even a problem there in the first place, I feel that there's an opportunity for this administration to fund a similar project where local people in the community could be part of this project, to go in and test the air quality to determine whether or not it's actually causing cancer. That has not been done. And one of the persons that we've been working with on this initiative is former, not former, he's retired General Russell Honore, who's now an environmentalist. And I believe that anyone who wants to find out what all of this how it relates to climate change, they just have to visit that area. When I went there, what was significant to me was to see the Mississippi River, which actually was higher than the levels, the areas around it. And you can see the barges along the Mississippi and all these chemical plants, these fossil fuel plants along this area, and all these pipelines along this area. And then there are the plantations. You can see the sugarcane plantations. A lot of the families that own those plantations sold the land to those multinational corporations that were located there. And to me, it's almost like a Disneyland of the fossil fuel industry, and it's causing a lot of problems for people that are living there. And I think that what this administration can do is to fund a project that I know that the community is working on now, to be able to use science to verify what they're seeing every day, why they're called Cancer Alley. And while we're doing that, there needs to be an effort to come up with, to deploy the type of innovation to make sure that the people are not being impacted by what's coming out of those factories. But I think at the same time, it would be significant to the environmental justice community if if this administration would provide the backing to the community to go and do that type of scientific research and be able to bring it back, and we can come up with solutions to how to deal with not only the cancer alleys down in Louisiana, but any other place that's dealing with similar issues around the country.
You know, you're well positioned on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council to lend your voice to that process, but I also noticed that you just gave testimony on the Hill last week, and I think you're going up again tomorrow. Can you talk a little bit about what you're talking about? Anything different than what we've covered? Anything?
Well, I think I'm just educating members of Congress about things in their district that they have not seen themselves in a lot of cases, about the sanitation issue and about how it relates to climate change and why we need to have investment and why the government needs to get involved. Because, you know, one of the things that has happened, I just recently was interviewed by someone from the PBS counterpart in Italy. And what the reporter said to me was, in Italy, the government would have taken care of this. We went to a home where there was it was a failing septic system where they had broken the lid off. You can look right down into it, you know, several feet down, and see the sewage actually coming into it. And the woman had called for help because it was backing up into her shower. So what I try to do is use plain folk language. You know, people get lost in statistics. They don't see a person. They don't see a family that's suffering. And I try to use those descriptions of what I've seen, the storytelling with the science, to be able to help them to understand what is happening in these communities and why they need to be involved and go, because some of them never go beyond where they're, you know, big cities and lots of people gather there. They need to walk their districts. I remember back in the day when we had stump politicians that would go to the local diner and talk to folk. And we can't do it from a statistical analysis. They're going to have to go down these dirt roads and meet these families where they are. And that's what I talk about when I go to Capitol Hill, to encourage them to do that, because a lot of them have not done that. And that's why these problems persist.
So you have in your mind, this is an issue that is pervasive, this lack of basic infrastructure. The scale of it, I mean, do you have a dollar sign of the types of investment it's going to take just in our country or just in one county? Do you have any perspective on what kind of size of investment we're looking at?
Well, we don't know, but I was told when I just went to Mount Vernon that the size of the investment that would be needed there would be $150 million, and that's just one area. That is 4 square miles with 100,000 people. I can tell you that the American Society for the Study of Civil Engineering, they basically said that when they graded our infrastructure, they gave our sanitation infrastructure a D+. So that's an indication of the scope of the problem that we have here in this country.
And investors are looking for opportunities, so that would be one.
I think that'll be a great opportunity. I think it'd be a great opportunity to not only provide, you know, what investors do is provide capital for projects, but it's also be an opportunity to have a social impact, and an impact that would go beyond just making money. It would also provide for the health of the community as well.
Yeah, I know that's important. You know, we're at RockCreek's offices today, and I know that ESG investing has been in fashion here before it was a trend nationally. You mentioned science a few minutes ago. I just want to go back and one observation I'll share. We have science back at the White House, and you're part of the advisory committee. You guys just came out with interim guidance, and you mentioned early on this whole government approach. What does that look like? How does that play out in your mind from your seat on the White House Council?
Well, in my mind, the way it plays out is that when a problem is identified, there's an effort to target it using all of the different agencies and what they can bring to solve those particular problems. And also, I think one of the things that I learned from serving on the task force that I had been pushing, but I think Gina McCarthy actually talked about it, is how we have to look at this from a health perspective too. And we have realized how it's important to have healthy citizens, to have a healthy economy. You know, we saw this with COVID, and one of the reasons that people are afraid now is because of the possibility of reversing the progress that we've made with this new variant because of the impact it has on the economy. And likewise, with the whole of government approach, I think that it's an opportunity to deal with all of these problems, the ones that the government can deal with, and then at the same time be a pilot for other communities across the country in terms of how to solve them.
That's great. If you permit us, I think we have a question from Zoom. So if we could go to the Zoom.
We have some audience, sorry, flipping the microphone. We do have some audience questions. I'm just pulling them right up here now. So, Ms. Flowers, you have said that sanitation is an issue that's too often out of sight, out of mind. What other issues need more attention and specifically more investment?
I would think broadband. You know, a lot of people just assume that internet access is available everywhere. I just remember when Reverend William Barber came to visit Lowndes County, and there was a team of reporters that were accompanying him that were from Canada, and I said to them, you need to write down the directions when we leave Fort Deposit so you won't get lost going to Pamela Rush's house, who I write about in the book. And the woman said to me, oh, I've been around the world. I can rely on my GPS. Well, she found they went off on their own. They never made it to where we were because they got lost, because the assumption was their GPS would work. But in places like Lowndes County and other places around the country where the internet is just not available, it's a problem. And then we saw this come to fore with the pandemic when there were children who could not go to school, but they couldn't even do their schoolwork. In Lowndes County, for an example, teachers were still showing up at school, putting together packets of work for the kids, where the parents had to go pick it up and take it home so that they could work without the benefit of being able to have online instruction. So that's another big investment that is sorely needed in communities. And then a lot of communities don't have services even like when we talk about COVID, there's no medical services available. I think that's basic infrastructure too. Even if it's an urgent care clinic, just making it available. At one point, I know through the U.S. Public Health Service, they used to actually pay for education of doctors to go to places like Lowndes County. I don't know if that still exists anymore, but programs like that do need to exist to go into areas that may not have the kinds of services that we think should be anywhere else. You know, we make a decision about whether or not we whether I move to Madison or Huntsville or Slap Out, Alabama. A lot of it would have to do based on what kind of services they're available. And I think we should do a survey of the country, and we'll find that there's lots of room for investment. We just need it.
Sure.
So on the subject of broadband, my hometown of Chattanooga, Tennessee, made broadband a public utility a few years back, and now has some of the fastest internet in the country, maybe even the world. It still needs to go out to more rural areas, but it's a start. Is that a good model, or what would you consider the best model for bringing broadband to areas that don't have it?
I think that's a great model, and I think, but again, every model should also include community ownership. I think we should take it to that next level because it keeps people there and it keeps them vested as well.
So we have a question online about specific to water and water infrastructure. What's the best way to get past 19th and 20th century thinking when it comes to water infrastructure and leapfrog, or I think, Kerry, you have a better word for this.
Slingshot.
Slingshot. That was the one I was searching for into the 21st century.
I think one of the best ways for us to slingshot into it is for some of the people that are making the policy or selling these failed solutions should go and have to live in a home for a month that doesn't have one that works. I just watched a movie on Netflix called Toilet that took place in India. And part of this movie, one of the officials, because the government there was moving real slow, according to this movie, and to make it move faster, the government official decided he would close all the toilets for a couple of weeks for all the people that were working for the government. So when they went to use the toilet, it wasn't available. but they changed the policy so that the people in the villages could get the services a lot quicker. So I think that's one way. And what we do is actually take people to places in Lowndes County for them to see it firsthand. And usually when they see it, it's like even when we went to Mount Vernon on Monday, to go in and actually see it is very different from reading about it. And I think that I have not taken anyone, no matter which side of the aisle they're on, if they have good sense and they've seen this and they've come out of that saying, oh my God, I'm not going to do anything about this. That doesn't happen. I think that people are generally shocked and that changes them.
And I think we have a question from our in-house audience. We'll pass the microphone.
Catherine, thank you so much for your leadership and for being here today. You're very inspiring in many ways. The connections between your work in rural America and places like Detroit, where Kerry's from, are significant. And I think about our friend Monica Lewis-Patrick, who's been fighting for years for water justice in the city of Detroit, for access and affordability issues. I guess my question is, connecting the dots between infrastructure of all kinds and the fact that right now we have an effort to diminish advocacy in this country and diminish voting rights, the access to the ballot. How are you seeing these things in an intersectional way? Because I think of water justice, I think of climate justice, I think of voting rights and the connections there. And I'd love to hear you speak about that.
That's a very good question. I think there is definitely intersectionality. And as I talk to my friends that are especially the big greens, and I've been telling them, really, you're going to have to do a lot of work in the South, too. Because if we lose it in the South, we lose it in the rest of the nation, and we're all impacted by that. And clearly, a lot of people that don't believe that climate change exists are in the places that are impacted by it the most, and they tend to be in the South, unfortunately. So you're right, there is intersectionality there, and a lot of the rules that are being made to repress or oppress the right to vote, we're seeing the connection between those people that are a part of creating climate change and the problems that we're having around this country, especially with pollution. And a lot of the communities whose votes they're trying to suppress are the ones that are suffering and suffering the most. So there's a lot of intersectionality. And yes, I do know Monica, and I've been to Detroit. I've actually been to Flint as well. And one of the reasons why I think the model should include community ownership, because Flint is an example of what happens when the community is not sitting at the table. Then we end up having a lead crisis that could have been avoided if the community had had a voice.
Senator Markey said this morning that a lot of our climate action needs to be related to jobs, jobs, jobs. How do we ensure climate justice with job creation?
Well, first of all, we need to make sure that a part of the ownership, again, comes from the community. And it not only creates wealth in the community, but it creates jobs as well. And we should make sure that people that a lot of the businesses, I know a lot of people are probably forming businesses right now so they can go in these communities that are under-resourced and be able to get the contracts. But the contracts should go to people that live in the community as well. And I think that that's one way we can create jobs in those communities. It should not be where everything is outsourced to somebody that just moved to Alabama just to benefit from what's going on. If that becomes one of the areas where there's a focus in terms of the government investment. It should also have that factor where the community people, there's community engagement, they're sitting at the table and they're receiving the benefits in terms of jobs as well.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to be able to join you to the visit to Mount Vernon, and one of the things that struck me when we were there was what a difference it makes if you were born, 20 minutes away from Mount Vernon in the city, if you're a kid who, doesn't have to worry about the toilet, using the toilet, versus being born in Mount Vernon, and the impact that it has on your capacity to learn, your access to economic opportunity. And so it was shocking to me just how invisible the problem is right now. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on the role of data, on the role of a mapping, on the role of understanding where these communities are. How could it be that for 21 years, this problem has been ignored in Mount Vernon? And so when we think about the opportunity that exists right now with the scale of the infrastructure package, with Justice 40, how do we make sure that we know where these places are and that capital goes to those places, both federal investments, but that then private capital can organize around that by really understanding the scale of the market and the scale of the need and opportunity for those communities?
That's a very good question, Davida. One of the things that we have found is that there is no central database on these wastewater issues that exist in this country. If President Biden wanted to get a list tomorrow of all the places that are having wastewater problems around the country, there's no place where that exists. So we've tried to tackle that, and we started this summer with 10 interns working in 10 states collecting information, and this is going to be a long-term project. But certainly what we wanted to do is find out, for an example, which states have people that are on on-site systems and where are they located. There's no central database, and it varies from state to state. We also don't have a central database that tells us which wastewater systems are failing or which ones that need to be replaced. So there is a major role that data can play, because I think we can't have solutions if we don't know what the problems are. And even I've just in my experience dealing with the WEJAC, when we were looking at indicators that could be used to identify these communities, there's a gap in the data that exists. In rural communities, for an example, with census data, we don't even ask those questions. I think that we need to even redefine the census so that we can get that. But in the meantime, because government moves so slowly, I think that we have to partner with the academic community and with the data community, our friends in Silicon Valley, that have experience in this area to help us collect this data so we can come up with better policy. And then the investment community can know who they need to target and where they need to go in order to make sure that these type of situations are addressed. Because the people in Mount Vernon are crying out for attention from investors, because once that happens, you're not only dealing with fixing a wastewater problem, but there's so many other business opportunities that could come there that area needs so desperately that they're not going to get as long as people cannot flush their toilets. And not only are the residents impacted there that we saw, businesses are impacted. Some businesses have had to close because they don't have functioning wastewater treatment there, because when they flush the toilet, it literally comes back into the homes. And we even went by a fire station where they had to move the first responders and the equipment away from this area, which is heavily populated, because the sewage coming back into the fire station. So that is an example of a place where investments, I think, would be sorely welcome, and it can make a difference in changing, but we need to collect that data. And Mount Vernon was an example of that.
Well, this conversation has really underscored for me the four-part crisis that we all have found ourselves in. And I think if going back pre-COVID, certainly, and from my previous experience, we cared a lot about the fiscal condition of the economy in the country and valued things around that. But what I'm hearing is a lot more around public health. We know that public health can take down and pause an economy. Climate change, we're watching it happen in real time. So this is a really fruitful conversation. I really want to say I appreciate you coming in person, which is rare. I'm in rarefied air with you. Thank you, Catherine. Thanks for joining us at RockCreek. I think we're going to wrap up unless we have any further questions.
We actually have one last question.
Okay.
I think we have just enough time. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. Do you have thoughts about the role of stakeholders outside of government and the finance sectors? For example, what do you see as the ideal role of academics, NGOs, and other stakeholders?
Well, I think it's very important for them to go and partner with people in those communities. I think what often happens is that people go into the communities, take advantage of the issue, get the money, and leave. So it is very important to have community involvement. have the community voices leading them, but go and offer help and ask the communities what they need. I think that that's a key way to have real partnerships and also to find solutions.
For me, it's listening first and providing that capacity that we talked about. That's the recipe for real engagement success. So
Yes.
thanks to all who joined on Zoom and the live stream, and to our audience here. Catherine Flowers, it's a blessing to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.